All right, so today we're going deep into the complete guide to sexual fulfillment. This book, you shared it with us, and it was originally published like way back in the 90s. So, kind of a time capsule, We're going to see what they were saying back then about, well, sexual fulfillment and how that all kind of stacks up today. And to help us, we'll unpack all of this. We've got an expert in, human sexuality and relationships with us. So, welcome.
Thanks. It's going to be really interesting to look back at this.
Yeah, so right away, just flipping through this book, the thing that jumped out at me was just how much it stresses safer sex. And it's interesting because this is before, HIV/AIDS awareness was as I guess widespread as it is now. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's really striking actually how the book how it really emphasizes personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Taking ownership of your sexual health and being open with your partner about safety and all of that.
Yeah, and they really get into the nitty-gritty of it too. Like there's a whole section on, how to use condoms correctly, even like tips on how to, bring up the topic of safer sex with your partner, which I think we all know can be kind of a difficult conversation to start sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. That open communication, that honest communication, it's essential, I think, in any sexual relationship, and that, includes obviously discussions about safer sex.
And then that leads really well into the next part of the book, which
Yeah.
is all about undressing each other.
Yeah.
And you might think, well, undressing, like what's the big deal? But they really present it as kind of like an art form, like a key part of foreplay.
It's about savoring that anticipation, right?
Yeah.
And sort of the revealing of yourselves to each other.
Yeah.
And they encourage couples to really see it as, a part of the whole experience, not just something you rush through.
Yeah, and there are some funny parts in here where they talk about, like different approaches to undressing. Like, the classic like striptease or, feeling shy about your body or,
Right.
that kind of awkward fumbling.
Yeah, and those anxieties about, body image, those are incredibly common, especially these days. And the book really stresses, being open about those things with your partner, creating that safe space so you can be vulnerable and intimate.
Yeah, and beyond the actual undressing part, they talk a lot about this thing they call sensual play.
Oh, that's all those things that,
Yeah.
they can build intimacy but aren't necessarily sexual, like holding hands, cuddling, kissing, all those little things that can, really make a difference.
And they even say, that kissing, it often gets overlooked in long-term relationships.
Yeah.
And that it needs a revival. And there's this one quote that I thought was interesting where someone says, like, if my husband doesn't kiss me enough, I just don't get turned on.
Mm.
And it made me think, like, how many couples are missing out on that?
It really makes you think about those little ways
Mm-hmm.
that we can stay connected to our partner,
Mm.
both physically and emotionally.
Now, this book, it doesn't shy away from topics that some people might find, a little bit delicate. And one of those is oral sex. And the language they use, it can be kind of clinical at times, but they present it as, a natural part of sexual exploration.
And what's important is that they acknowledge that.
Yeah.
Not everyone is comfortable with oral sex for all sorts of reasons,
Yeah.
cultural, religious, personal, and that those boundaries need to be respected. No one should ever feel pressured into doing something they're not comfortable with.
Yeah, and they also get into the hygiene aspect of it, like being careful about, spreading bacteria and things like that.
Right. It all comes back to that, respecting yourself and your partner.
So they talk about, different positions for intercourse, but what I found really interesting was their emphasis on, communication and being in tune with each other and really like adapting to the mood of the moment. It's not just about, going through a list of positions. It's about finding what works for you and your partner.
Exactly. It's about,
Mhm.
really connecting with your partner, being present, being responsive,
Mm.
and being willing to experiment and find what,
Yeah.
really brings you both pleasure.
And then, they get into orgasm and they talk about both, male and female orgasmic responses.
Yeah.
And they debunk some myths along the way, like the idea that women have, less orgasmic capacity than men. And they also talk about faking orgasms and the pressure that women might feel.
And that's such an important topic. Encouraging women to really understand their own pleasure and to be open with their partners about what they need and want.
And speaking of, exploring what you want. They've got this whole discussion about the G-spot
Oh, yeah.
and its potential for, a different kind of orgasm.
Well, the G-spot has been a topic of, a lot of discussion over the years and research. And even though there's still debate about, whether it's a distinct anatomical structure or not,
Yeah.
many people do report, you know, pleasurable sensations in that area.
So it's really about, exploring your own body and seeing what works for you. Now, get ready for this. They have a whole section on adventurous lovemaking. And I'm not just talking about, positions. They actually delve into the history of sexual exploration. And they even mention, like, the Kama Sutra.
That's really interesting. The idea of adventurous sex, it's been around for centuries.
Yeah, and they approach it with a mix of, and
Yeah.
enthusiasm, but also caution. They acknowledge that not everyone is, comfortable with certain positions or practices, and they emphasize the importance of respecting each other's limits. And there are some positions in here that I was like, whoa, okay, but it's all about, exploring and finding what works for you as a couple.
And always making sure that you're both comfortable.
Yeah.
And that you're communicating openly.
Yeah, and you know what else they normalize? Mutual masturbation. They present it as a totally fulfilling activity, either on its own or as part of foreplay.
I think that's great. They're really challenging that idea that intercourse is the only, real or valid form of sexual activity.
And they even describe like specific techniques for both partners.
It's about being open to trying new things.
Yeah.
And expanding your sexual repertoire.
And then perhaps the most, fascinating but maybe also challenging topic they cover is sharing sexual fantasies.
Yeah, that can be really tricky, but it can also be incredibly rewarding if you do it right.
And they really stress the importance of trust and consent.
You need to feel safe with your partner
Yeah.
to be able to share those intimate thoughts and desires.
And they actually give, some examples of fantasies like, striptease or role playing. And even just reading about them, I was like, ooh, okay.
Could definitely spark the imagination.
So, okay, we've talked about fantasies. Now let's talk about, the more practical side of getting turned on. And they have this whole section on enhancing arousal. And one of the things they talk about is skin teasing, using different textures.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, like they talk about, using leather, silk, feathers. It's all about, engaging your senses.
I like that. It's about being mindful of what feels good for both you and your partner.
And you know what else they're big fans of? Spontaneous sex. They say it's a great way to rekindle the passion in long-term relationships.
But spontaneity shouldn't come at the expense of, consent and privacy.
Right, exactly. And they have some pretty funny suggestions about places to have spontaneous sex outside of the bedroom. Like the kitchen table, the bathroom.
Okay, well, those can be fun. But again, it's about respecting boundaries.
Okay, so let's be real. Not every sexual journey is, smooth sailing. And the book acknowledges that,
Yeah.
Challenges can come up in any relationship. And they talk about these things called sensate focus exercises. I have to admit, I'd never heard of those before.
So sensate focus exercises, they're basically a series of exercises that are designed to help couples enhance intimacy and overcome, sexual difficulties. And they do this by focusing on mindful touch and communication and taking the pressure off of, achieving orgasm.
So it's about reconnecting on a deeper level, right? Both physically and emotionally.
Exactly.
And they actually, lay out specific exercises.
Yeah, they start with, non-genital touch.
Yeah.
And then gradually progress to full sexual intimacy.
Okay, so this book, it really is comprehensive because they also get into, contraception, and they go through all the different methods, hormonal options, barrier methods, even sterilization.
But it's important to remember that, this book was published a while ago, and some of that information might be outdated. So it's always best to talk to your doctor to get the most up-to-date information about contraception.
Yeah, good point. And they even talk about, emergency contraception.
Yeah.
Or the morning after pill.
Which thankfully is much more readily available now than it was back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, they also address the topic of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and they stress the importance of, seeking medical attention if you have any concerns.
And of course, prevention is always key.
Yeah.
And that's where those safer sex practices we talked about earlier really come into play.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground here. What would you say is like the biggest takeaway from this first part of the book?
I think the overarching theme is really the importance of communication
Mm,
in creating a healthy and fulfilling sexual relationship.
well said. And we'll be back in part 2 to continue exploring this book, so stay tuned.
So we're back diving deeper into The Complete Guide to Sexual Fulfillment.
And one of the things that I really appreciate about this book is it's not just about, the mechanics of sex. It really encourages like a sense of playfulness and exploration. Like it's a journey.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important. Sexual fulfillment, it's not just about like reaching the destination, so to speak. It's about enjoying the whole ride.
And what I like is it recognizes that. There's no like one right way to do things. It's really about finding what works for you and your partner.
Yeah, every relationship is different. Every individual has different needs and desires. So communication is key.
Now, I have to admit, when I first saw the section on adventurous lovemaking, I was a little I don't know, apprehensive maybe.
Yeah, that title can be a little intimidating.
But it's actually not as wild as it sounds.
Well, it depends on what you consider wild, I guess.
True, true. But the book is really careful to emphasize that. It's all about finding what you and your partner are comfortable with.
Right, it's about pushing boundaries, but always with consent.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind that this book was written, you know, a while ago. So some of the language might seem a little bit outdated today.
Oh, for sure, but the core message is still valid.
Hmm.
Communication, respect, exploration.
Oh, okay. So one of the sections that I found really interesting was the one on sharing sexual fantasies.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because, it can be kind of a touchy subject, but the book, it gives some really good advice on how to approach it.
The key is to create a space where both partners feel safe,
Hmm.
to share their thoughts and desires.
And they emphasize that, just because you share a fantasy, it doesn't mean you have to like act it out.
Sometimes just the sharing itself can be really intimate.
Yeah, and they acknowledge that, fantasies can be all sorts of things. Some are playful, some are, more intense.
And some can even be, a little scary
Mm.
or reveal some deeper insecurities.
So it's important to be sensitive to that.
And to always be respectful of your partner's,
Yeah.
feelings and boundaries.
Now the book also talks about, the fact that sometimes things don't always go smoothly in the bedroom.
Right. Every couple faces challenges at some point.
And they discuss things like, erectile dysfunction, low libido, and they offer some practical solutions, like those sensate focus exercises we talked about.
Yeah, those can be really helpful for a lot of couples.
And it's a good reminder that, if you're struggling with something, you're not alone.
There's help available, whether it's, seeing a therapist
Hmm.
or just talking to your partner.
Now, we should probably mention that while this book is a great resource, it's not a substitute for, professional medical advice.
Right. If you have any concerns about your sexual health, it's always best to talk to your doctor.
And especially when it comes to things like contraception and STDs, the information in the book might be a little outdated.
Absolutely. Medicine is constantly evolving, so it's important to stay up to date.
One thing that I noticed that the book really stresses is personal hygiene.
Oh, yeah, that's crucial.
It might seem like a small thing, but
Yeah.
it really shows respect for yourself and your partner.
And it can make a big difference in terms of, enjoyment and safety.
So I think we've talked about communication a lot already, but I just want to emphasize again how important it is.
It really is the foundation of a good sexual relationship.
It's about being open and honest about your needs and desires and also about listening to your partner.
And being willing to,
Compromise and work together. And I think this book does a really good job of highlighting the importance of mindfulness, in the context of sex.
yeah, that's a great point.
It's about being present in the moment, paying attention to your sensations, and really connecting with your partner.
And also being aware of your own body and what feels good.
As we're, talking about all this, I'm thinking about how much things have changed since this book was published.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We're having more open conversations now about things like consent, body positivity, diversity.
And that's a good thing.
But even though this book might not address all of those nuances, I think the basic message is still really relevant.
It's about approaching sex with respect and communication and a willingness to learn and grow.
And I think that's something we can all benefit from.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what would you say is like the most important thing for our listeners to take away?
That's a good question. I would say remember that sexual fulfillment is a journey. It's not a destination. And it's a journey that you take with your partner.
Well said. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll continue our exploration of the complete guide to sexual fulfillment. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into the complete guide to sexual fulfillment. It's been really interesting revisiting this book and seeing like what still holds up today.
It really has. Some parts definitely feel, a bit dated,
Yeah.
but the core ideas are surprisingly relevant.
Yeah, and one thing I've been thinking about is, this book doesn't really talk about things like sexual fluidity or different gender identities, which, are things we're much more open about now than back in the 90s. But the emphasis on communication and consent and self-discovery, I think that lays a good foundation for navigating those complexities in relationships today.
I think that's a really good point. When we create that space for open dialogue,
Yeah.
and respect each other's boundaries and are willing to learn and grow together, that creates a foundation for genuine connection, no matter, how we identify or who we're attracted to.
And something else I appreciate about this book is it reminds us that pleasure isn't just about, what happens in the bedroom. It's about bringing that sensuality into our everyday lives.
Oh, absolutely.
Like through, holding hands or a hug or a kiss.
Yeah, those little moments of affection,
Yeah.
they can really make a difference.
I know I'm guilty of sometimes forgetting about that.
It's easy to do, Life
Yeah.
gets busy.
And I also like how the book, it doesn't shy away from the fact that sex isn't always perfect.
Right. Every couple goes through ups and downs.
They talk about challenges that can come up.
Yeah.
And they offer, solutions like those sensate focus exercises.
It's a good reminder that,
Hmm.
it's okay to ask for help if you need it.
And speaking of help, we should probably say that while this book is, a great resource, it's not a replacement for, professional advice.
Definitely not. If you're having, persistent issues
Right.
or any concerns about your sexual health, talk to a doctor or a therapist.
Yeah, they can give you the best guidance. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the complete guide to sexual fulfillment, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would say embrace your sexuality, be curious, be open, and never stop learning and growing, both on your own and with your partner.
I love that. Sexual fulfillment is a journey, and it's one we can all enjoy. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.